So first things first, whenever you're editing a photo, you want to look at it for what it is. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Make sure you're editing the photo to complete the story. Make sure they're all cohesive and that every photo belongs together. Because when you start doing a bunch of filters on one and then not on the other one, or if you change, all of a sudden you have a bunch of sepia in there, if you have a bunch of random bright colors and then all of a sudden you mute the colors, it's not going to look cohesive and it's going to look like it's completely different photo shoots. So don't do that. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pay attention to a few things right off the bat. One, do you want the photo color or black and white? And you can decide that right here, right now by doing this. White balance is tricky because if you don't already know, temperature and the color is controlled by the light temperature. And the light temperature is called a K value, a Kelvin value. And this one believes it was at 6,050, which means it was 6,050 Kelvin. Now, it is dividing it into warm tones, which is over here, and then cool tones. So what this is doing is this slider is adjusting it compared to, since we're outside, the color of the sun. As the sun gets lower in the sky, it gets warmer. So the light gets warmer color, not temperature, color. So what you do to counteract that is you actually go back and you try to take that back a couple notches to neutralize that change in color. And we're doing that right now. We're scrolling through here, we're getting this temperature changed, and you're just going to make your sliders move back and forth wherever you want to do it. You have another option here, which is actually your color picker. And what you're going to do is you're going to find either white, black, or gray. So you see right here, this gravel is pretty gray. I can click that, and it's going to try to match the white balance best as possible based on what it believes is a neutral color, which is white, black, or gray. And you see if I do this and I select her red dress, it's going to change everything over to this green and blue color because it's picking the opposite of what the color is to neutralize it. Remember how we were talking about that, if you haven't watched the video yet, talking about the exposure triangle? I believe that there is such thing as, your temperature triangle, where is whatever the temperature is outside versus what you shot it at, there has to be a neutralizing factor. So just bear that in mind whenever you're editing your photos. Always kind of figure out what the neutral color is that balances out that color so it looks real life. Okay. So that's that portion. Exposure and contrast. Exposure is just how much light was in the photo. If it was too dark, you're going to want to raise the light. If it was too bright, you're going to want to lower the exposure. All right. A little bit goes a long way. Don't go crazy with it. I just think this photo is good right there. Don't click auto. Avoid your temptation to click that button. Don't do it. It doesn't always know what it's doing. Sometimes it works. Most of the time it doesn't. All right, contrast. That is telling how much you want each section of the photo, of each section of color, the separation from the next color. So it's asking how much do you want to divide your colors from one another. Lower contrast means there's less division, and then more contrast means there's maximum division. So you're seeing the big differences between the different colors of your photo. I prefer a little bit more contrast. Again, just like exposure, a little bit goes a long way. Highlights. Highlights and whites are very similar. Highlights focus purely on the absolute white portions. So absolute white meaning, again, whatever's going to be up in this top right corner. So things like her shoulder blade right here, his hairline over here, where it's basically there's almost no data. Highlights is going to pull that down, okay? So you lower the highlights altogether, and most of the time it's going to make it where it just flattens out that section, essentially eliminating contrast from those portions. Add it all the way, and it's just going to maximize everything around it, as well as that highlight. Now for whites, very similar, but it's going to be pulling the minor highlights out of everything else. It used to just be highlights and shadows, but they've recently changed it to where it's now got whites and blacks in there as well. So as you can see, like the road changes. On the flip side, shadows is absolute shadow. As you can see, maximizing that out over there, does that, lowering all the way. You notice over in the corner here that it's doing all that kind of stuff. And then blacks is everything. It just lowers the black on every color that's in the photo. After we've done that, then we can move down to our presence, which presence is clarity, vibrance, and saturation. Now, don't mess with these bars too much, because this is when photos start looking very, very amateur. When people start going crazy with this. So with clarity, when they're dragging this back and forth, you either turn them into ghosts or zombies, okay? And that's kind of like my ongoing teaching lesson is we don't want ghosts or zombies in our photos. We want, if we're gonna do it soft, we want nice, soft, like kind of surreal. And if we want hard edge, I hope you're proving a point, because there's no really reason to make these any sharper or any more clarity to it. A lot of people think, oh, I'm just making it sharper. You're not. What you're doing is you're bolding the lines. You're making more artificial space, which is not necessary. Now, vibrance. Vibrance is not saturation, but it does affect colors quite a bit, like saturation does. Vibrance takes the colors in the photo and it just tries to make them either pop or resolve. So I'm trying to get rid of again, like the big differences in color if I'm lowering the vibrance, and I'm trying to maximize the color with vibrance. Again, not much needed here. It's just think of it like cologne, you know, too much of it and it's gonna start ruining the entire room. So don't do it, okay? So I use boosted a little bit. Same thing with saturation. There's really never a reason to boost saturation unless your ISO is really high and you removed a lot of color from it. Otherwise, if you're going to remove saturation, you're probably going to end up moving all of it and making it black and white, which, just as a note, shortcut key for lowering saturation all the way is V. All right, the next section down here, this is probably in the last 3 years become one of my favorite tools. This is actually the tone curve tool. And remember how we were talking about the shadows and the highlights and stuff? This directly affects it. And if you look inside here, what do you see? It's your histogram. So your histogram is on here and it's showing you where your absolute blacks and your absolute whites are, okay? So right here and then everything in between. Now this is a really powerful tool because just by dragging it a little bit, you can see all these changes start to happen to the photo in specific areas. Now just note, every piece on this section, every piece on this line means something to the photo. And you'll notice that by when I click this button right here, which is essentially kind of like your color picker tool, wherever I'm dragging this at, look at my line right now over that histogram, over on my tone curve line. See it moving back and forth? It's because every piece of this photo is represented by that histogram. So if I go right over here to his hand and I want to brighten that hand up a little bit, all I gotta do is click on there and it's gonna grab everything that's matched by that same tone and highlight as his hand, and it's gonna raise it. Now I don't like this highlight right here, so I wanna lower this a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna do that, and it's gonna lower that quite a bit. So you're noticing that different things like that are getting affected as I'm changing where I'm grabbing, okay? Now another thing that I like to do is I like to actually raise up the absolute black level, because what that does, I'm actually going to reset this because this is not how I actually do things. Whenever you're raising this absolute black section, you're getting rid of the absolute absence of color and light, which is, you want it to be represented in the photo somehow. But what I do is I make pointers, so whenever you affect this and nothing else is selected, the whole line is going to move, but I don't want it to. What it's going to do whenever you make a stop like this is it's actually going to only affect this, and then it's going to dull down the effect as you go on, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So I put one over in each quarter of this section. So each box, each quarter of this histogram has its own division. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise this up. Oop, not right there. It's kind of finicky sometimes. Try to grab it in the bottom left corner. I'm just going to raise that up. Okay, and you notice how up here it all changed? So let's go back and forth for you. Back and forward. See how it brought this to life a little bit. Got rid of that absolute black that just kind of seemed boring, and it just added a little bit of feeling to it just by moving that notch up a little bit, okay? That is your tone curve. The next thing, this is something that some people get a little wild with, and I don't think it's necessary, is their HSL, and this is when they start changing the colors all around. And everything on here is represented just like your tone curve. Everything is represented by a color, all right? So I can change all these and it's gonna move, you know, if I want their skin tones to go from, you know, natural to all of a sudden they look like a tomato, I can, just by moving that over. But we're not gonna do that. A lot of times I like to mess around with the skies by messing around with my blues or my aquas, but that's about it. Saturation, same concept. If you want to desaturate a color, a single color, that's where this comes into play. Unfortunately, there's people out there that still do the whole selective coloring thing. Please don't do that. It's not necessary. Selective color is very old and it's not cool anymore. People don't buy it. So don't just all of a sudden be like, hey, I want everything black and white except for her red dress. Oh my God, it's so gorgeous. I love it so much. It's not. Just don't. Please don't. Okay. Now the next thing is luminance. It's how bright each color is. So if I want her dress to be a little bit brighter, I can raise that up. If I want a little more shadows, I can do that. Okay. Luminance just means how bright, how much light it is. The next section is split toning. This is unused by me. I hardly ever use split toning. This is where we start getting those funky filters where you're like adding color to the shadows and highlights and stuff. I don't really find any need for it. Some people do. I just never have. So moving on. Detail. Remember we were talking about the sharpening. That is not done by clarity. That is done by the sharpening section. Now you want to notice right here that there's a red section right here. See this? That's saying danger. Don't do that. Don't go all the way up here, because what you've just done is you've created this like almost artificial look to the photo. So don't do that. Just keep it simple. You know, it's like your cologne. Keep it simple. We're gonna put that on like that. And radius affects how much area around every part of the photo you want to be sharpened. So it's basically, it does a math equation that decides every so many pixels is gonna sharpen the pixel. So when you increase the radius, it's increasing that number. So, or it's decreasing the number rather. So every 5 pixels I want it sharpened. Every 1 pixel I want it sharpened. Every quarter pixel I want it sharpened. You know, that's what radius does. Detail, that is how defined you want that to be. And I can show you that by either going way down here, which the detail is going to be very minor in how much you see that sharpening, or very major in how you see that sharpening. Now, I didn't change my sharpening that much, so you're not going to notice it. Masking is another one. Masking is really important. And it's what you need to know is whenever you're sharpening a photo, there's some things you don't want sharpened. Sometimes you just want the edges sharpened or a hairline sharpened or something like that. That's where masking comes into play. Now, it's hard to tell whenever you're doing it just without seeing the modification. But with masking, what you're deciding is I only want certain bits of the photo to be sharpened. And you notice that by hitting Option or Alt on a PC. So Option on Mac, Alt on PC, and then clicking on this and dragging it. And now you see how it just all of a sudden turns into like spaghetti. As you start dragging it, you'll notice that all of a sudden it's just her hairline and just the edges of her clothing and just pieces of that. So what I'm doing is I'm masking the different sections of their bodies and different sections of the photo to select only those sections. So now only right here the edges are getting modified, because I don't necessarily want the blurred out images back here to be sharpened, and now they won't be. Okay, so noise reduction. So whenever you add sharpening, you're basically telling it that I want it to add fake noise, essentially, to the photo to correct what I didn't do, okay? It's just like how we talked about ISO and how it raises the noise. That's what sharpening does. Same thing. So luminance is having a bright speckle, like having all that noise from that high ISO or raising the sharpening too much. Now you also have your detail, which detail is how much detail you want removed from, or how much detail you want saved for the photo versus how much you want removed from the noise. And then contrast is how heavy that noise was. And the same thing down here, it's just the color speckles. Sometimes you'll just have white noise, and sometimes you'll have like purples and reds and stuff like that. Most of the time, it shouldn't be a big deal. Lens correction, not something I would suggest playing around with just yet, but just to kind of briefly overview. Lens correction is how you're going to define which lens you're using, and sometimes certain things like your focal length matter whenever you're taking a photo. So if you didn't already know this, the lower the focal length, and focal length meaning is it a 15 millimeter or is it a 70 millimeter? Is it your 18 to 55? What is it? So the smaller the number, the more distorted the image will become, okay? So with this diagram here, you see that it is at the narrower focal lengths, or the smaller focal lengths, you're getting the face is looking really, really distorted, and it doesn't look right, okay? Like your nose is going to be bigger, it's going to make the shapes of everything else around you kind of be off. It's not until about 50 millimeters that the face starts to look normal again, and it's not until 50 millimeters that, like, that's kind of how we see the world. So picture it that way. If you want more true to life photos, use a 50 millimeter. If you're looking for like getting large scenery stuff, then you can get an 18 millimeter, just back up. Don't get close to somebody with an 18 millimeter because it's going to make them look kind of like a cartoon. So that's what this does. Now the effects, this is another one people getting themselves in trouble. I see this all the time. They'll just take this bar and I'm gonna jam that down there and get my vignette on there, and that is high class. It is not. Don't do that. Only time I ever use this is if I'm trying to draw in attention, and watch how much I do it. Boom, right there. That's it. That's all you want to do. I mean, even 7 is too much. Like, I think 3 is appropriate, because all I'm trying to do is crisp up the edges. That's all I want to do, and just hone in the focus towards the middle. That's what a vignette is for, not for making a frame. A vignette is not for making frames. And the same thing like this. People do this way too much. Don't do that. Sometimes you might have darker edges like this. In this situation, I would actually probably use a vignette to lighten up the edges rather than darken up the edges. And in this situation, I would just do like a +6, and see, just up here, all it did was raise that up for me. That's it. Now you can adjust it. You can do the midpoint where you want that to be, which just changes what the center of the shape is of the vignette itself. You have the roundness, which is taking either from an oval or a circle, and then feathering, which I highly suggest you feather it, because it either makes it a hard frame or it softens it up to where it actually looks like that. And just for the sake of being, I'll show you what that means. So you either have that right there where there's no feather and it becomes a frame, or you have an absolute feather where it fades in really nicely. Same thing with the roundness. You can go from that, a square, all the way over to a circle. Grain. Grain is kind of fun. I actually do add grain to some of my photos to make it look a little more filmy. And you can change the amount you want. I mean, you could add all the grain you want. I don't suggest doing that, but you know, you can do whatever you want. Some people like that really, really grainy, filmy look. I don't love it, but it's cool in some situations. So just decide what you want your photo to look like. Okay, almost done. All right, now we're on to camera calibration. These two sections don't really need to mess with. This is just asking it what version you want to use. If you never really use Lightroom, then you're not going to want to change it, because this is just like if somebody's used to using a different version, then they'll change that back. Like if they are used to using the 2010 process, then that's what it's going to do. And then this, don't worry about this either. Just leave it on Adobe Standard if you've had it changed or something like that. This is very similar to your split toning. You're going to change it either to you can change the colors of your shadows, but it's not going to be as drastic. I don't usually do that. Now, this right here is where I usually start messing around with things. And that's because sometimes skin tones get a little wonky whenever you are editing them too much, or you change the color, like the white balance of the shot. So that's where this comes into play. And sometimes I will make it, and I'll make it a little bit more red, and then just desaturate just a touch. Because sometimes you make people look like tomatoes on accident, and you don't want that to happen. Now the green primary, this is a helpful one because it's going to take your greens and make them a little bit either more bluey, you know, and I like to raise the saturation on this because I think it gives life. And then your blue primary, as I said, everything is made up of red, green, and blue. Your blue primary is either going to make it look more like this kind of stuff, or it's going to make it a little more pastel-y. Now that's your option. I don't really mess with this one too much because it is very drastic. But you can change it a touch. So that's it. I mean, that's pretty much all there is to editing a photo. I went through every single line by here. I know it's very tricky trying to absorb all of that. It's a long video. I suggest if you have to, watch it again or remember where you were. in the section that you wanted to pay attention to and go back to that and listen to it again. And now I guess we're going to export.